Other news tonight: in less than 48 hours, local death row inmate John Henry Ramirez will be executed by the state.
I'm in the artery, I hit in the neck, I hit in the groin, I hit in the lung.
8-year-old Vicky Lynn Hoskinson disappeared while out riding her bike one day in September of 1984.
Only the most brutal of people have ever faced the ultimate price for their heinous actions. Many spend years waiting for their final day, and as always, they are given a final request that the prison system will honor whenever possible. But some requests are strange. Some are even confusing, where others are completely sick and twisted. Today, we look at some of death row inmates' unimaginable last requests. One of the most chilling last requests of any prisoner came from John Henry Ramirex. His request was so unusual that it became part of a legal battle, where Ramirez would take on the prison system to get his own way.
37-year-old was sentenced to death in 2008 for the fatal stabbing of Pablo Castro, a 45-year-old convenience store clerk, during a 2004 robbery spree in Corpus Christi.
All of this started over $1.25. When 45-year-old hardworking father Pablo Castro was taking out the trash during a shift, he could have no idea the danger that was heading his way. He was an employee of a convenience store in Corpus Christi, Texas. In 2004, Ramirez was on day 3 of a narcotics binge with 2 other women, Cristina Chavez and Angela Rodriguez, when the 3 decided they needed more money to continue.
We were smoking, we were smoking. We were taking mainly Xanax, but we had like Valiums and hydrocodones, and then we were drinking vodka too.
Ramirez was no stranger to trouble, with a list of convictions already on his record. They had committed several robberies during their binge, only this time Ramirez would take things too far. The 3 pulled up to the convenience store, and seeing Castro, they decided to act. Ramirez jumped from the van armed with a sharp instrument, which he used on Castro, inflicting life-threatening injuries from which he did not survive.
Castro died immediately, leaving behind 9 children and 14 grandchildren.
He then emptied Castro's pockets and made a getaway in the van. Ramirez did all of that for the $1.25 Castro was carrying at the time. The same night, Chavez and Rodriguez were arrested, but Ramirez managed to flee and evaded capture for the next 3 years. He was finally caught on the border of Mexico in 2007 and would stand trial in 2008. He and his 2 accomplices were found guilty, and they would face heavy prison time for their heinous actions.
It took us less than an hour to come to a decision about whether he was guilty or not. There was no doubt about his guilt.
Chavez was sent down for 25 years, and Rodriguez was given 99 years. As the man who took Castro's life, Ramirez would pay the ultimate price, his very own life. What followed would send the legal system into a meltdown, as one man took on the entire prison system in order to get his last request. While serving his sentence, Ramirez became close to his pastor, Dana Moore, of the Second Baptist Church in Corpus Christi. But Moore could have no idea that he would become an integral part of the final moments of John Henry Ramirez's life. Over the next several years, Ramirez managed to delay his final and ultimate sentence, first by requesting a new lawyer, and secondly, by using the pandemic to his advantage. Eventually, his final day was set for September 21st, 2001, and after all the delays, you'd think he'd have used up all his chances, right? Well, Ramirez had one more trick up his sleeve. For his last request, he asked for Pastor Moore to be present at his final moments. But this wasn't to watch from the sidelines. He wanted the pastor to hold his hand on his chest and pray for him during his last breaths. Naturally, the state refused his request, so Ramirez filed a lawsuit to counter the state, and a messy battle would begin. Ramirez would claim the refusal contravened his right to freedom of religion, and their decision was nothing more than religious discrimination. The courts agreed.
It was back in March when the U.S. Supreme Court granted Ramirez's request for his pastor to place his hands on him and pray aloud during his execution.
On October 5th, 2022, Ramirez is administered the dose of chemicals that will put him to sleep forever. As promised, Pastor Moore was there, and 15 years after this sick and twisted criminal took the life of an innocent convenience store clerk, he finally paid the ultimate price. As Pastor Moore said a prayer, it was reported that Ramirez took 2 short breaths, then began snoring until finally the life drained from him. Pablo Castro's son, Aaron, was only 14 years old at the time and had plenty to say about the long, drawn-out process. This is a $2.3 million process. Let's get it on. Stop costing the people money, stop costing the family heartache, and let's get him that sentence that 94th District Judge Bobby Galvin handed down to him. Ramirez may have been able to drag out his case for as long as possible, but he could not escape his inevitable fate. But next, we take a look at a man who made the strangest request ever. Trinity County, Texas was not the type of place that experienced the kind of tragedy that would take place on October 9th, 1984. So notorious was this day that locals who were not even born when it happened talk about this infamous, brutal accident. When the police arrived on the scene, they discovered 3 family members, Gene Hathorn Sr., his wife, Linda Hathorn, and their teenage son, Marcus Hathorn, had lost their lives by horrific means. The area was littered with clues, and police were quick to act. But they would soon learn this evidence was not all it appeared to be. They found human hairs and cigarette butts at the scene, but they failed to nail a main suspect after a month. Then they came up with a lead that would point the finger of blame a little closer to home. There had been arguments about money between Gene Hathorn Jr. and his father, and officers started to believe the family had been taken out over money. The father had recently come into possession of $150,000, and it was starting to look like Hathorn Jr. had his eyes on the wealth, whatever the cost. With his father out of the way, Hathorn Jr. would inherit that money, or so he thought. It turns out his efforts were in vain, as he had already been written out of his family's will just 3 weeks before. Hathorn Jr., his accomplice, James Lee Beathard, became friends after working in a psychiatric hospital, and when Hathorn Jr. told of his desire to take his stepfather's life and his money, Beathard decided to get in on the act. But when this case hit trial, the 2 friends turned on each other, and the blame game would begin. Beathard would face the courtroom first, and the star witness against him, none other than Hathorn Jr. His testimony was devastating, and he pinned the whole world, or at least the worst of it, on Beathard. According to Hathorn Jr., his accomplice took the lives of 3 family members and planted the false evidence. Beathard was given the ultimate sentence. He would pay with his life. That's when Hathorn Jr. went into his own trial. The district attorney accused him of being the main man responsible and believed he had committed the perfect crime. And the jury believed him, sentencing him to the same fate as Beathard. Beathard spent the next decade protesting his innocence, but would finish his appeals and pay the ultimate price on December 9th, 1999. Hathorn's case would be a little more complicated. He would appeal in 2009 based on his trial attorney's failure to introduce evidence of his childhood trauma he had been through. But after he failed his appeal, he had an unusual request that would literally turn him into fish food. It was all part of an art exhibition where the ground remains of his body would be used to feed the fish in an art piece that was symbolic of prisoners' last days on Earth. The request was never realized, as he actually won his appeal and is now serving consecutive life sentences, reportedly working as a prison cook in the general population. Although this next final request would not be as grotesque as being turned into fish food, it would certainly leave many unnerved, as one prisoner wanted to ensure he had the last laugh. Monday, September 17th, 1984 was the very first day Carlson Hoskinson had allowed any of her children to go out on their own. She had asked 8-year-old daughter Vicky Hoskinson to mail a birthday card to her aunt. Vicky was a bright and popular young girl, and only too happy to help her mother, so she grabbed her bicycle and started the short journey to the mailbox. After 20 minutes, her mother became concerned, and she anxiously let Vicky's 11-year-old sister, Stephanie, go out to look for her. Then, the nightmare for this family began.
We just will look forward to the day to where we get to be reunited with her.
Stephanie found her sister's bicycle lying by the side of the road only a few blocks away from their home, and everyone assumed the worst. Thankfully, one man had seen suspicious activity at the time and did what any good citizen would do. Sam Hall was the coach at Vicky's school, and when he saw a man making odd gestures in a vehicle near the school, he decided to note down the license plate just in case. Another girl had seen a man driving past her house, and he made a rude gesture towards her, and a third witness saw the same car driving into a telephone pole. As soon as Hall heard Vicky was missing, he contacted police and passed on the most crucial lead the police could have gotten. The owner of the car was 28-year-old Frank Atwood, who already had a disturbing criminal record involving crimes against children.
Witnesses place Atwood, a convicted child molester who was on parole at the time, in that very neighborhood.
The car was registered to his parents, who were shocked when the FBI turned up on their doorstep looking for their son. Within hours, Atwood came home complaining his car had broken down, and he needed them to wire him some money to pay for it to get fixed. His parents then passed on the address in Caryville, Texas to the FBI, and they drove out to apprehend their suspect. When they arrived at the mechanic's shop, they found Atwood and his traveling companion, James McDonald, and detained them both. It had been 10 days since Vicky's disappearance before Atwood was caught, so the interrogation was crucial. Atwood did not deny being in the area of the disappearance. In fact, he told them he was staying at a nearby park. At 3 p.m. that day, he left to buy narcotics and returned at 5 p.m. This placed him firmly in the right neighborhood at the right time, and he had a 2-hour window that just so happened to coincide with the time Vicky disappeared. McDonald confirmed Atwood's story, but also gave the officers some disturbing new information. He claimed the two had an argument, and then Atwood had left the park, only to return at 5 p.m. But when he did return, his hands and his clothing were red-stained. When McDonald asked him what had happened, he said he had been in a fight with a narcotics dealer, and the narcotics dealer had come off worse. There was no physical evidence inside Atwood's car that would link him to Vicky's disappearance. But the outside of the car was a different story altogether, where crucial evidence could be hiding just out of view.
The vehicle, a 280Z Datsun, missing its front bumper, which sits in court evidence.
On closer inspection, they found exactly what they needed.
This is what Frank Atwood's car looked like back in 1987. Now fast forward to several decades later, the car still stands in evidence.
Paint on the bumper of his car matched paint from Vicky's bicycle, and using expert forensics, the prosecution were able to determine that he knocked her off the bicycle before scooping her up into his car. On December 3rd, 1984, Atwood pleaded not guilty to taking Vicky Hoskinson and would wait almost 2 years before his trial would begin. Sadly, there is no happy ending to Vicky's story, as on April 12, 1985, a walker discovered her remains on the Sonoran Desert near Tucson, about 20 miles from where she went missing. Atwood's trial in January 1987 lasted almost 2 months, but ultimately he was found guilty as charged and sentenced to pay the ultimate price. His final day was set, June 8, 2022.
It'll just be a beginning of a different chapter, and it will not be with him there. No more. And we're looking forward to that, because if you think about it, I'm 67 years old, and most of my life has been around this case.
His final request was both bizarre and sickening. He had been given a choice between lethal injection or lethal gas. He wanted gas, but not the kind they would normally use. Atwood requested that they use nitrogen gas, or laughing gas as it is known. Imagine how you might feel being the family of Vicky Hoskinson, watching as the man who took your daughter's life was laughing to his last breath. As you might expect, the state refused to accommodate Atwood's request, so he was given an injection and lost his life on the scheduled date of June 8, 2022. Vicky's mother had plenty to say when the date was announced.
My first reaction was, hallelujah, finally.
This was the last family photo taken with Vicky in it. Throughout the years, her family has carried her memory and the grief with them, waiting to see the conclusion of this case.
But if that request is bizarre, this next final request is downright eerie. Tommy Douglas Arthur, also known as Tommy Arthur, is one of the sickest men on this list and is the one with the sickest final request. On the morning of February 1st, 1982, police responded to a disturbance at the home of Judy and Troy Wicker in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Once they got inside, they were greeted with a scene of pure horror. Troy Wicker had lost his life in his bed with massive injuries to his head. Judy was found alive on the floor in the bathroom, and her sister, Teresa Rowland, was kneeling beside her. Judy told officers that after she had dropped her kids off at school, she had returned home with Rowland to find a strange man in her house who physically hurt her before taking the life of Troy and then fleeing the scene. An investigation led to the arrest of Judy Wicker, who was accused of ending Troy's life in order to cash in his insurance. She would face a trial where she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. After her conviction, she came forward with crucial evidence that would blow this case wide open. She claimed there was another suspect and he was responsible for pulling the trigger that fatal day. For her testimony, she would try and bargain for an early release. So, who was the mysterious male caught in the middle of this? Tommy Arthur was staying at the Decatur Work Release Center at the time of the crime. When Judy told police of his involvement, he was arrested. A second trial over the death of Troy Wicker would begin, where she would be giving evidence against Arthur. Judy would claim that she and Arthur had known each other since they were young, and together they had planned to take out Troy. But they weren't alone. Remember the third person at the scene, Teresa Rowland? Well, she also became involved. Judy claimed that she, Rowland, and Arthur had all hatched a plan to eliminate Troy Wicker as early as 1981.
Juries at 3 trials convicted Arthur on charges that Wicker's wife hired him to kill Wicker. Arthur has denied killing Wicker over the past 3 decades, maintaining his innocence.
How did Rowland get roped into all this? Well, she had asked Arthur to commit arson on her own home so she could collect the insurance payments. The plan was concocted after Judy told the pair she was being hurt by Troy. It was around this time that Judy and Arthur began a relationship, and suddenly their plan to get Troy out of the picture was becoming a thing of reality. Judy testified that she knew the incident was going to happen and met Rowland and Arthur on February 1st, 1981, before going on to Judy and Troy's house. From here, Judy attempted to play the victim, claiming she asked Arthur not to go through with it, something he ignored. But she did admit that she paid Rowland and Arthur a large sum of money out of the insurance money she had collected. In this second explosive trial, Tommy Arthur was found guilty of taking Troy's life and was sentenced to pay the ultimate price. But it would take a very long time for his final day to come, as over the next 4 decades he escaped his fate no less than 7 times, earning him the nickname Houdini, after the famous magician. But when his last day on Earth was set for May 2017, Arthur requested he be allowed to choose how his life ended, and he chose the firing squad. He had his reasons, claiming that injection would be extremely painful due to a back injury he had developed while incarcerated.
Now, the U.S. 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied a last-minute request to stay his execution after he challenged the state's lethal injection drug and procedures for administering it. Arthur denies his involvement in Wicker's killing.
On May 26, 2017, he finally faced his fate and fell asleep for the last time after a dose of life-ending serum was administered. Next, one prisoner requested a last meal that contains a stomach-churning main course. Born in 1952, Smith was working as a cab driver in Houston, Texas, when he fell in with the wrong crowd and began committing petty theft. But petty theft would become a whole lot more on the day of March 7, 1983. 44-year-old Larry Don Ruos was the company district manager for the Union National Life Insurance Company in Houston, Texas. He was a hard-working family man and well-liked by his employees. He was with one of those employees that fateful day when Smith approached the counter. He produced a weapon and threatened the teller, ordering her to hand over all the cash she had. The teller refused and then hid behind the counter, leaving Don Rose staring down a potentially trigger-happy and dangerous individual. Don Rose complied with Smith's request and filled a plastic bag with all the cash he could. Then the situation turned sinister as Smith threatened Don Rose. The district manager pleaded for his life, even taking off his expensive gold bracelet to offer. Smith pulled the trigger and left left him with life-threatening injuries. 2 office workers had seen the whole thing and began pursuit of the suspect into a nearby apartment complex where they ducked for cover as Smith fired at them several times. It was when Smith left the complex and tripped on the street that several brave onlookers apprehended him and waited for law enforcement to arrive. Don Rose was rushed to the hospital, but despite the efforts of the medical team, he sadly lost his life. Smith was charged with taking his life and would face a courtroom to answer for his crime. However, during the jury selection process, Smooth managed to break loose and escape the courthouse. But it appears escape is not something Smith can get right, as once again he was apprehended, and this time there would be no escape. The trial shocked the local community, and with all the evidence pointing right at Smith, he was found guilty as charged on April 5th, 1984. Naturally, he appealed the decision, but his appeal was thrown out by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and his final day was set for May 11th, 1988. When the day finally came, Smith managed to win a reprieve. His mother's attorneys asked the Supreme Court of the United States to spare his life, based on the ground that Smith was mentally incompetent, and amazingly, the Court of Appeal agreed to hear her case. But if Smith thought that this would be his ticket to freedom, he was totally wrong. The appeal was quashed, and once again, his final day was set, this time for June 26, 1990. Smith refused any more appeals, and another by his mother's attorney was refused at hearing, meaning Smith would face the final consequences for his brutal actions. Just like every other person in this case today, Smith made a final request. He would ask for one thing only: a plate of dirt for his last meal. This wasn't any dirt. This was Ray Kunda dirt. It was used during voodoo rituals, and he had planned to eat every grain. It might come as no surprise that the state did not grant his request, so instead he chose to eat a yogurt before being led into the chamber where he would spend his final moments of life. It is reported he claimed innocence right until his very last breath, but with so much evidence against him, it's clear that this is one man who deserved everything he got. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can keep up with every chilling new case.